Good evening. Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck.
Always glad to be
It's
here.
always good to see you in person.
It's good to be seen.
Right, and hopefully our extraordinary TV audience rejoices when they see you as well. Is that a
Well, I'm sure there's
statement on my part?
Well, I'm sure there is some sort of strong reaction. I'm not sure exactly what that reaction
Well, good.
is.
I'll assume it's a favorable one. We can hope that. Well, we talk about many things, and the overreach of our species is certainly in evidence everywhere in all generations, in all human endeavors. The idea of being just a little too arrogant is a troublesome fact. And one thing that happened in 1912 was when the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank. And I know you have some interest in this subject, as I'm sure you've examined human overreach and hubris in great detail during your many productive years on the planet. I mean, but what do you think about that? I mean, any comments? Why did it happen? Are there lessons we can extract from it today? Why did it hit the iceberg?
Well, we have actually extracted a lot of lessons from it. I think we did learn a lot of lessons from the Titanic. But yeah, you know, I'm interested in the ocean. I'm interested in oceanography, marine biology. I'm not a specialist by any means, but I've always loved the water. I'm a scuba instructor. But you can approach the whole Titanic situation from so many different directions. You can approach it from a technological one, a corporate one. You can approach it from a class approach, comparing the first class to the steerage passengers. You can look at governmental regulations. Whatever direction you want to take this in, we can take it in. But it was really one of the marvels of the early industrial era, and a lot of things just went very wrong, and in such a spectacular way that it really did draw a lot of attention in terms of technological development, safety regulations, and even what you might call class relations.
Well, there are many ways to take this conversation. Let me direct it toward human era and how these catastrophes take place. In my younger days, I had occasion to look at the shuttle blowing up.
Yes, Challenger in '86.
And then apparently what happened, people had responsibilities to make sure everything was okay. And everyone attempted to narrow their sphere of responsibilities. So each person tried to restrict their responsibilities as much as possible, and it created gaps between the human chain that existed. Now, were there such gaps in the hitting the iceberg? I mean, was there a person's job was to be on the lookout? Or was there a person that was supposed to report ice flows? Was there were they racing across the North Atlantic too quickly? Which particular faults could one identify in this chain of causality?
Well, yeah, I think that last phrase used is important, chain of causality, because I will say, as a scuba instructor, one thing that I have noted is that usually you don't, if there is some sort of problem with scuba, if there's a catastrophic event or a fatality or something, and I'm assuming this is true in most fields of endeavor, it's usually not one sudden, unforeseen, catastrophic blowout that nobody could have seen coming or anticipated that instantly makes the situation irretrievable. Often, in retrospect, you will see a lot of smaller things that create what you call, and I think quite correctly, the chain of causation. And if you can break that chain at any one point, the final catastrophe never happens. So there are a lot of things going on with the Titanic. I suppose two of the earlier ones would be, first of all, the idea of the blue ribbon, the imperial competition between, or I should say among, the English, the Germans, and to a degree the French.
No Americans in the.
The Americans
in the
weren't
runs?
really. They were not the primo competitors at this point. The two big ones were really the English and the Germans, the two big Teutonic states, if you will, to make the most impressive liners. And most impressive was very largely, but not completely, the fastest, the ability to make the fastest transatlantic crossing. There was no official blue ribbon. It's sort of like the Triple Crown in horse racing.
Yes.
It's a thing, but it's not an official thing. And so you had this pressure to go quickly. You also had, of course, the emphasis on safety, because they were aware. I mean, the people have always been aware that to go out in the ocean, the ocean, any kind of water is potentially the most destructive force on Earth. And the Titanic was well designed. It actually was. The unsinkable, and I don't think there was ever any official claim that she was unsinkable. But there were, if I remember correctly, 10 watertight compartments. And the idea is that she could float with any 2 or 3 of these compartments flooded. And they could not conceive of any sort of circumstance that would open up more than 2 or 3 of these compartments to being flooded. And I'm fudging with these numbers. It may be 4 compartments, but they couldn't imagine a catastrophe that would open more than these number of compartments. And therefore, even with those compartments flooded, she wouldn't sink. And they were basing this on the way collisions had tended to happen before, and those collisions tended to be either, if you will, head-ons or T-bones.
Yes.
And that would limit the number of compartments that would be flooded. There were watertight doors between the compartments that actually did work very, very well. They had several different systems for springing those doors shut. You could do it by central control, which was a great development. You could do it by local control, and you could even do it by flooding, that if one of the compartments flooded to a certain point, the door would close itself. But what they didn't foresee, and obviously in retrospect should have, would be a glancing blow along the side of the ship that would essentially open it like a can opener and tear open about 6 of the compartments. And on top of that, the watertight bulkheads were not built high enough. Once again, they didn't foresee a situation that the flooding would be that extreme. So they decided to save a little money. And those 2 things ultimately spelled the death of the ship.
Now, you mentioned the class system. I mean,
Yes.
apparently, if you were in, I guess, the lowest class, whatever that would be, economy class, anyone that flies credit airplanes probably knows where that is.
Yes.
But you're packed in, and many immigrants there, a lot of Irish immigrants possibly.
Irish were, on this particular trip, Irish were the bulk of the steerage passengers.
And they were coming to the U.S. presumably as immigrants, and I don't think there was any kind of quota, was there? If you could get in, there were some restrictions.
Very much so. We hadn't hit the early 1920 limit.
Anyone could come. The country needed people. Well, people were there, and not too many of them survived. And then up in the, I guess, the first class part of the ship, a much bigger number survived.
Yes.
And one kind of story that comes out of that is Archibald Butts, if I got his name correctly. But he was I think he was a graduate of Swanee, and he had a pistol where he carried his own weapon, and allegedly, as the ship was going down, he was pulled out his pistol and kept the lesser, I guess you'd say, not too genteel males that were trying to push the ladies out of the way to get on the boat. He kept them back, and then allowed the women and children to get on the boat. And the idea is if you were a male in that culture, that would be what you would do. And then I think he's commemorated in numerous places for having done that. And I think Winston Churchill made a comment, well, this just proves the superiority of the Western ethos. This is the way we behave, Christian gentlemen. This is what you can expect from us, and it sort of gives us the right to rule the world in a way, and that we can make these gestures.
Well,
So
colonialism at its best or worst.
Well, can you want to bounce the basketball on that? Was that would that happen now? Firstly, no one would have a gun, I don't think. And it was that every man for himself. The ladies are being elbowed out of the way as these more robust males jump in the.
We have a lot to unwrap there.
I'm giving you something.
Yes. Well, individuals might not have guns, but today in a security-minded society, I'm certain that there would be plenty of weapons on the ship.
Yes.
And somebody might end up doing that. But that brings us into the area of gender equality, gender relations. It would play out very differently. But
Would it? That's a big question.
Yeah.
Would it?
Yes.
Would people say, well, I'm not going to play my gender card right now. I'm going down with the ship, or I'm not strong enough to get in the boat, and therefore, so a Darwinian situation where my physical frailty is going to condemn me to the ocean deep.
Well, you never know. In a situation like that, and I don't want to get too far down this road because I think we need to take a step back first. But there have been panic situations or crisis situations in which people have tended to behave very, very well and very, very civilly, and then there have been others in which the baser instincts just take over, as they often do in times of extreme stress. And so I think it might depend very much, on the dynamics of the particular group, the particular crisis, as to what would actually happen. But the fact is that it needn't have happened at all, because everyone knew that there were not enough lifeboats on the Titanic to handle the entire complement of passengers and crew. The irony was, of course, that that this is the dawn of government regulation, and there was not as much government regulation back then. There was some. But Titanic was actually up to code in its number of seats on life rafts. It was not sailing in violation of the code. And in fact, it was the Titanic disaster that prompted a major overhaul of those safety codes, and now requires that there be seating for everyone on the ship. And of course, several of those lifeboats, through mismanagement and the problems of getting people loaded, were not themselves fully loaded. There could have been more people put on those boats.
Well, one's not going to survive long in the North Atlantic.
28-degree water.
So you're going to go out pretty fast.
Yes.
Have you ever been in really cold water?
I have indeed.
And your legs just stop working. I mean, you can't move, and then the heart goes.
Yes.
Just stops beating.
Well, the coldest water I've ever felt, the instant the water hit me, I did not feel cold at all. It was just shock. I mean, it was just shock to the system. Mm-hmm. You gasped and couldn't, and it was not 28 degrees by any stretch. So yeah, the survival has got to be in terms of minutes.
A few minutes in the cold water, you're dead unless you can find some raft.
Yes.
Now, it was really kind of a tragic story. There was nobility, there was knavery, there was hubris.
It's a microcosm of humanity.
Right, and the idea was this could not happen. And occasionally we have plane crashes. I mean,
Yes.
you wouldn't think that planes can crash. They happen, and
One would certainly think that. Yes.
and all kinds of things actually can happen. We've got these possibilities of mischance around us everywhere. I mean, it's a little worrisome about the possibility of these things happening. Mm-hmm. Now, should we feel more confident now that we are living the 21st century, Titanic disasters can't happen to us. And I'll insert the notion of artificial intelligence, which is a burning ember, so to speak. Is that going to be humanity's salvation? And I know this is a subject you have some interest in from your scientific, I guess, fiction interest.
Well,
but, I mean, so is that going to save us, the artificial intelligence? And presumably they'd run the chances of different things happening, and the subject or the technology is just taking off right now.
Yes.
And so presumably in a decade or so, all kinds of inquiries would have been made by artificial intelligence that would lessen, we can hope, chances of misadventures occurring.
I completely disagree with that.
Good, okay.
But
well, that's what conversation's about here, yes.
But first I want to put in a plug for science fiction. I think I heard a touch of condescension there, but I do want to point out that the science fiction visionaries, I think, have been engaged in just a little short of 100 years of some of the greatest thought experiments we've ever had. And I'll just mention a couple of examples. Probably the most famous one that immediately occurs to me is Arthur C. Clarke, who is one of the absolute giants of the golden age of science fiction, who postulated well before the space age began the geosynchronous communication satellite. And so what we have now, we have geosynchronous communication satellite, probably because engineers are science fiction geeks and they decided to make it a reality. If you look at Star Trek, an entire generation, probably my generation, although I'm not an engineer, grew up thinking, I want a handheld communications device. I want a touch screen. I want an automatic door that opens instantly when I want it to open. I want a computer that responds to my voice commands. And they went out and invented what they had seen on Star Trek. We have all of those today.
Dick Tracy's wristwatch.
I'm wearing one. Yes, I can get text on my watch. I can get cell phone. I can get phone conversations.
So these things happen.
Yes.
And
but the systems are too complex that as you add variables, there are literally tens of thousands of ships on the ocean right now at any given time. I don't know the number of just commercial flights in the air right now at any given time. But as the number of variables increases, well, you're a neuroscientist. How many connections, neuronal connections, are there in the brain?
A big number.
And the more you add to it, the more can go wrong.
Well, that's the issue with
Yeah.
causality.
Yes.
I don't want to get too far off the Titanic, but we're on AI a little bit. But
Yes.
I think the deal is the coding. So, for instance, tracking airplanes, that's pretty good. I think that's something that can happen. However, if the things are less definite, particularly anything that involves humans, depression, we're going to track depression, or we'll do whatever we do. So the interface between reality and what goes into the computer system, that's where the errors can take place.
Yes.
And so if you have, and the other thing is the sophistication and legitimacy of the algorithm. So sometimes the algorithm have errors in them that are not obvious to start with, and it certainly could be. It's a pretty worrisome possibility.
Well, you remember the Y2K bug. So that's a famous example.
Right, with errors that occur in AI, and we have to be very careful about being too reliant on it, and making sure there are plenty of checks and balances in the apparatus. Lots of checks and balances, and even having blundering humans involved. That's probably not altogether bad, as long as they don't screw it up too much. But they can sort of have an overview. Well, the Titanic goes down, and did this injure British imperialism? And this was a terrible blow to self-confidence, imperial self-confidence. We're not really masters of the planet the way we imagined we are. Any thoughts about that? And how different climatic changes can have an impact, or these icebergs don't behave the way that people imagine they would, and there were really no inquiries about icebergs too much, were they?
Well, no, they knew the danger of icebergs at that point, because during that season, the typical route between the British Isles and the North American ports did bring you within range of the bergs. But the problem is, of course, radar had not been invented yet at that time. Geosynchronous or GPS satellites, of course, didn't exist, so navigation could be tricky, especially on cloudy nights. And even radio, which is one of the most revolutionary pieces of technology that the maritime world has ever had, because now for the first time you can have real-time communications between a ship and the shore. But the radios at the time were of limited range, and 24-hour radio watches were not kept on board ships. So they were still not quite experimental, but being close to experimental. And this is one of the great criticisms that Titanic sent the CQD, or Come Quick Danger Morse signal, and also the new SOS.
Yes.
But ships that were nearby and could have reached her within the 2-hour time window had shut down their Radio Shacks for the evening. So yeah,
it's a number of arrows that take. Maybe that's the way nuclear destruction occurs.
Exactly. The number. You talk about how good our computers are and how good our programs are, but in I believe it was 1979. Human error, somebody put in some training tapes at NORAD, and for a few minutes, we believed that there was a nuclear strike inbound. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is Carter's national security advisor, was awakened and said, we may have a nuclear strike in progress, and then they caught the problem. On the Soviet side, about 3 years later, a Soviet colonel in their equivalent of NORAD, a man by the name of Petrov, was on the night watch, and he saw 4 inbound missiles. And according to the playbook, that said nuclear strike, and he was supposed to push the button, and he decided, no, if the Americans were carrying out a strike, it would be more than 4 missiles. I'm not going to push the button. And he saved the world by not responding. So, you keep on thinking, AI is going to protect us from all this, and it's impossible to catch. Because if you're talking something like nuclear Armageddon, you have to bat 1,000. 999 is not good enough.
No.
And that's, so.
And if you actually look at the mathematics of it, if you have one chance in whatever number it is, something horrible happening, and you have infinite time, then you could imagine the infinite time something is going to implode unless the teeth of the dragon are pulled.
Yes.
I mean, we still have our dragons there, and the same kind of unexpected tragedy that took place in the North Atlantic in 1912 could happen in a millennium, maybe in 2 millennium, whatever the story is.
And probably less than that. One brief example, the sea was too calm that night. It was a very dark night, and the sea was so calm that that the icebergs were not stirring up any kinds of wake or iridescence, which made them extremely hard to spot. So a 10-knot wind, you might have had a different result. Another irony is if the iceberg had not been spotted at all, and the Titanic had run head-on into it, then the scenario that the unsinkable moniker was applied to would have happened. It would have crushed 1 or 2 of the watertight compartments at the bow of the ship, but the ship would have floated. They saw it just a tad too late and maneuvered, and it ripped open several of them. So when you're talking little details like that you're dealing with a matter of seconds or a butterfly's wing, you can't control for every one of those variables. You simply can't.
Another issue is diurnal rhythm, your level of awareness. So if
Yes.
you're late at night,
Yes.
possibly your wits might not be as good. And so I believe this happened in the dead of night.
It did.
And so maybe people are a little drowsy and as they took their watch. So really quite a tragedy.
And there's a reason that nuclear or even conventional military strikes take place in the early dawn hours for precise. Well, traditionally it's because with conventional weapons, of course, you'll have had all night to move your weapons and units into place, but also your enemy is going to be at that lowest ebb at that moment. So there are two good reasons why these things happen early in the morning.
The Nazis attacked the Soviet Union at 3:30 in the morning.
Yes.
The war starts, or the Japanese.
The Poland as well, Pearl Harbor.
Right.
So.
People. So that's the danger time of it.
Yes.
Well, did this great tragedy spark international collaboration? I mean, did international ice patrol things happened?
It did.
Directly before the start of World War I, just
Yes.
A year or two before this terrible catastrophe, and people were collaborating with one another, and presumably the Germans and the British were aware of their commonality in this arena, and yet this terrible catastrophe happened thereafter, and the icy death that appalled people happened more in just a year or two, 3 years, when the German submarines started to torpedo different Lusitanias.
Yes.
People try out that cold North Atlantic water again, and so humans, the tragedy, which was an accidental tragedy, humans now said, I want to inflict that tragedy on my enemy, which causes a certain kind of brooding, doesn't it?
Yes.
So if everybody could say what a terrible tragedy the Titanic was, and then we're going to inflict that tragedy on our, actually, you could say the two great Teutonic nations, if you wanted to use that nomenclature. They're fighting brother against brother. They fight each other and they kill each other. So
Yes.
it's a bad story,
Yeah.
isn't it?
I would say, I would modify that slightly, because Lusitania really was beyond the pale. That if you look at warfare at sea, that generally speaking throughout the ages, warfare at sea, if you think about it, has been warfare either in defense of or against property. This is how navies emerge, because no one lives on the sea. It's simply a means of getting goods and people from one place to another. And of course, during wartime, the big issue is goods. Now, that's not entirely the case. Obviously, if you've got a troop ship in your sights, with 5,000 troops aboard, that's going to be a legitimate target of war, and your target is, in that case, going to be people. But that's why the Lusitania was so shocking. It was the September 11th of its day, because the Germans claimed, and this was really their entire justification for the attack, that the Lusitania was in fact carrying contraband of war, and that these 1,500 civilian passengers, women and children and such, were in fact, if you will, being used as human shields. And the Germans were right about that. You can still dive on the Lusitania. You can find contraband there, but the fact that the Germans would ignore those human shields and blow them out of the water really was a horrifically shocking event. And the Germans, the Imperial Germany, which was remarkably tone deaf about public relations, had the effrontery to coin a commemorative medal. On the one side, you see the Lusitania going down with airplanes and ammunition boxes and things spilling off the sides. And on the other side of this medal, there's a ticket office selling tickets to the Lusitania to these unsuspecting passengers. And the ticket office is manned by a skeleton, which is selling the, so that first that they did it, and secondly that they celebrated it.
Well, on that rather grim note, I think
Yes.
we have to conclude our evening's discussion, but thank you so much.
Indeed.
Buck, we'll have some more interchanges. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.